Hello everyone and welcome back to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for helping me reach to 50 subscribers. Let's reach 100 subscribers before the end of January. So sit back, relax and enjoy. Chris really liked his work, or rather, his busyness. He was a photographer and worked for himself, so he could take time off whenever he wanted. The moment for a break had arrived. The young man realized that he had been working too much lately and decided to go somewhere for a week or two. Recently, he had been thinking about traveling around the country and taking beautiful photos. In fact, he had long wanted to buy or rent a little house in some remote place, but kept putting it off. Now he realized it was time to act. Buying a house in just a couple of days might be difficult, but renting one for a vacation was entirely possible. On the appointed day, Chris got up early, packed his things, including his camera, and hit the road. He planned to head toward Oregon. He had several reasons for this. Firstly, Chris had never been there before. Secondly, he had seen photos online and noted the beauty of the area. It was clear there would be plenty to see. The journey ahead was long, about 800 kilometers. Chris had never driven such a long distance before. However, he was confident in himself. Before setting off, Chris stocked up on energy drinks, filled his gas tank, and, after warming up his car, left his driveway. Some people might not enjoy such a trip, but not Chris. He generally liked traveling alone. He wasn't particularly sociable, and working with people all the time drained him completely. Sometimes, he just needed absolute silence. Now, as he drove down the highway, he sang along with the radio. However, the signal soon disappeared, and he had to switch to the music he had downloaded in advance. Chris intended to cover the distance in one day, but couldn't. With about 200 kilometers to go, he realized fatigue had caught up with him, and he needed to stop somewhere soon. Along the way, he noticed a sign for a settlement. Apparently, a village with the peculiar name Ravenwood was 10 kilometers off the road. Chris decided to head there, hoping the locals would take him in. When he reached the village, he found it was inhabited and seemed like a place where he could stay for a few days if the locals would host him. He hoped they would, as the surrounding nature was so extraordinary that he wanted to photograph every corner and walk around the area as much as possible. Besides, his fatigue wasn't going away, it was only getting worse. The village was surrounded by tall, sturdy trees. Nearby, a river flowed. Chris noticed that the river was unusual. Its water was so clear that the bottom was visible. Large stones lay on the shore, and the river itself wound its way through the landscape. Chris took several shots of the scene before heading toward the locals. Walking down the main, and only, street, he noticed that although the houses were old, they had retained their grandeur. The owners clearly took great care of their homes and yards. Most of the houses were log cabins, but here and there, stone houses appeared. It was strange to see wooden frames, shutters, and decorative trims on the windows, weather vanes on the roofs, and picket fences around the properties. The windows themselves were also wooden. Chris noted that he hadn't seen a single plastic window. Wow, interesting, he thought. Do they not have the means to install them? Or do they just not see the need? Chris noticed a house a few meters away and decisively headed toward it. It didn't look any different from the others. Most likely, ordinary people lived there who might offer a roof over his head for a certain fee. I hope the owners won't refuse me a place to stay, he thought as he knocked on the door. A middle-aged man came out onto the porch. The homeowner was dressed in baggy sweatpants and a worn tank top. It was clear he wasn't expecting guests, as he was dressed in his usual home attire. "What do you want?" the man asked. Chris hesitated but mustered his courage and replied, "Well, I was driving and wanted to stop for the night. Could I stay here? Or maybe someone else in the village rents out a house?" The man smirked and said, "Rents out a house? Kid, the only thing that comes here is the occasional traveling store, maybe once a week, or someone's relatives. Strangers like you are rare here. So, no, nobody rents houses. Well, maybe I could still stay somewhere?" Chris asked nervously, fiddling with the hem of his shirt. "Well, since you're asking, you can stay with us." Chris wasn't thrilled about the idea of living under the same roof as this gruff man, but he didn't refuse the offer. It was clear the locals didn't exactly welcome guests with open arms. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Henry." "I'm Chris." "All right, come on in. What are you standing there for?" Chris grabbed his bags and followed the man inside. Once inside, he was shocked. The house's interior seemed straight out of the past. Of course, he hadn't expected modern renovations, but the only piece of modern technology in the house was a radio. Even that wasn't exactly modern, it seemed to date back to the 1980s or 1990s. Still, compared to everything else, it was relatively new. The family living here cooked on a wood-burning stove, and instead of an electric kettle, they used a coal-fired samovar. They washed clothes by hand. The house had no plumbing. Instead, there was a well in the yard. Surprisingly, there was at least electricity. Chris wondered, how will I charge my phone here? "Wife," Henry called out to a gloomy, unpleasant-looking woman who was kneading dough in a large basin at the time. "What do you want?" "We have a guest." "What kind of guest?" "Stop messing with the dough and take a look." She glanced at Chris from under her brows and asked just one question. "You hungry?" "I wouldn't say no." "I'll set the table now." "Sit here for now." "And my stuff?" "Where can I put my things?" "Henry, show him the way." "Come on," the man grumbled reluctantly. Chris obediently got up from the table and followed his neighbor. The man led him to a small room where there was barely enough space for a bed and a tiny nightstand. "Well, this should do for a couple of days." "All right, thanks." "Do you have a phone?" "I do," he said proudly and pulled a button Nokia phone from his pocket. "Do you have a card?" "What kind of card?" "A road map?" "No, a bank card to transfer money." "No such thing." "Then take this." With these words, Chris handed him two $100 bills. "For the lodging?" "Yes." Henry silently stuffed the money into the pocket of his sweatpants and left the room. Chris felt awkward staying with his family. He decided not to linger here and to leave as soon as possible. The lady of the house set the table. Incidentally, Chris still didn't know her name. "Excuse me, what's your name?" "Grace," she replied curtly. "I'm Chris. Nice to meet you." She only snorted in response. Chris noted that these two weren't very talkative. Yet the table was generously laid out, various liqueurs, pickles, meats, pies, everything imaginable was there. Strange, they seem unwelcoming, but the table's so abundant. Maybe they're expecting someone else? Thought Chris, but aloud he said, "Shall we toast to meeting one another?" They raised their glasses without much enthusiasm and clinked them with Chris's. Chris figured alcohol might loosen their tongues, so he started telling stories and recalling different events from his life. However, the hosts only occasionally made comments and chuckled dully. It seemed Henry had a limit on sentences, as he never said more than 3 at a time. Meanwhile, Grace only replied curtly, unable to string together more than 2 words. Late at night, when everyone had gone to their rooms, Chris thought about the generous payment he'd given Henry and decided he wasn't going to leave without getting his money's worth. He took the money but doesn't want to see me? They can work off the payment to the fullest, Chris thought before falling asleep. The next day, the atmosphere in the house was the same as the day before. Grace and Henry spoke little and did so rudely. Chris couldn't care less about their antics and decided to head to the river. After all, it was a hot day. He spent almost half the day there, then came back home, quickly changed, and, taking his camera, went out to photograph the places that had caught his eye earlier. Chris ended up spending the whole day outside. Exhausted, he went straight to bed upon returning, skipping dinner entirely. A few hours later, Chris woke up with a strong urge to use the bathroom. He tried to go back to sleep but couldn't. Squinting groggily, he lazily shuffled to the outdoor toilet in the yard. Chris walked quietly, trying not to wake the hosts, and silently stepped off the porch, wary of the neighbor's dogs barking. He took a few steps and saw something strange ahead of him. In the yard, near the neighbor's fence, stood 3 figures. He immediately recognized Grace and Henry, but the third man, who seemed to be a neighbor, was unfamiliar to Chris. The trio stood motionless and silent, and it seemed none of them even blinked. To Chris, it seemed strange and eerie at the same time. He decided not to make any sudden moves and simply stood there, watching what would happen next. First, Henry raised his right hand to the back of his neck, then pulled at something, and suddenly the skin on his shoulders began to deform in an odd way. Moments later, Henry's face wrinkled grotesquely before it seemed to melt downward. Chris watched, unable to look away. He finally understood what was happening. The neighbor's skin was sliding off his head and body, revealing something slimy and black underneath. In the darkness, it was impossible to make out exactly what had replaced the man's appearance. The same thing happened with the neighbor. A few minutes later, his skin lay on the ground. When it was Grace's turn, Chris suddenly realized it was time to leave while he still could. He walked back to the house as quietly as possible, but the grass rustled treacherously underfoot. Chris didn't close his eyes all night. At first, he listened to every sound, and when he heard the hosts return, he pretended to be asleep. However, there was no need. They didn't even enter his room or talk to each other. Instead, the couple quietly went to bed without disturbing Chris. Maybe it all worked out, he thought, then immediately corrected himself. Yeah, right. What the hell even was that? With these thoughts, he started searching for any information about the village. However, he found nothing useful. The village, named Ravenwood, wasn't even marked on the map. Then he began combing through old social media posts and reading abandoned forums on the subject. In a few posts that he managed to find on the internet, there were only beautiful photos, similar to those taken by Chris. The comments on them were typical. What a beauty, share the coordinates, where is this place? And so on. But it was only on one forum that Chris found a comment that caught his attention. Ravenwood is not exactly an ordinary village. At first glance, it seems no different from others, but if you spend some time there and talk to the locals, you'll realize what's so off about it. In the village, no one has modern appliances, no stoves, washing machines, refrigerators, not to mention vacuum cleaners, fans, PCs, or air conditioners. In some houses, you might occasionally find radios or TVs in wooden cases. You might think that poor people live there, but that's not the case. What can be said about the inhabitants here? The residents of this village are rather gloomy and unsociable. Even within their families, they hardly talk, let alone with strangers. But the most frightening thing is that the people in this village are not entirely human. At first glance, they look completely ordinary, but at night, these creatures often transform. After midnight, they they shed their skin, and under that skin hides something else. It looks as though their muscle skeletons have been painted black and coated with something like glue. It's a disgusting and terrifying sight at the same time. My friend and I, when we saw this, bolted out of there. I survived, but my friend, unfortunately, did not. These werewolves literally tore him to pieces. This happened back in 2005. We were third-year students then. Being young, we wanted to find some adventures. Back then, you, William, my late friend, came up with the idea of going to this backwater. He had either read or heard somewhere that creatures lived in that village. And so he dragged me along on this trip. Going to a resort or a music festival was beyond our budget at the time, so I eagerly accepted his suggestion. We got to the nearest station by train and then walked for about 20 kilometers. Saying we were exhausted would be an understatement. William was still full of energy, but I was miserable because I had decided to wear new sandals. Well, it was hot outside, and I didn't want to trudge to the village in sneakers in 30-degree heat. When we arrived at our destination, we were completely spent. William knocked on the first house he saw and asked for a place to stay overnight. The owners, an elderly couple, let us in without much enthusiasm, even though we paid them generously. They spoke to us only when necessary, and the old woman grumbled at us constantly. At that point, I wanted to suggest to William that we head back to the station, but he was adamant. We had paid them, so they had to deal with us. I remember falling asleep right in my clothes, while my friend wasn't in a hurry to lie down. Unlike me, he decided to go out for a smoke before bed, and that's when he saw the creatures in all their glory. He screamed in fright, ran into my room, and started waking me up. We jumped out the window and bolted. But everything didn't go as smoothly as I had hoped. Somehow, we got separated. William ran headlong, while I couldn't run because of my blisters and hid in the bushes near an abandoned house. Apparently, I was saved by the fact that I was wearing black clothes and managed to hide. William was caught and literally torn apart. I turned away almost immediately, as I was afraid of passing out and giving myself away. When they went back to their homes, I crept out of my hiding place very quietly and sneaked toward the road. No one chased me. Perhaps they didn't think of capturing me, or maybe they just didn't bother. As for William, he was considered missing. Even though I filed a report with the police, the case stalled, and no one was held accountable. I don't know why. Later, I learned that ordinary people used to live in that village, but at some point, a strange man moved into the forest near the village. I don't know if he was a hermit, but one thing was clear: he consciously chose to live away from people, settling in the woods in a dugout. Initially, the locals didn't interact much with him, but eventually, someone began visiting him in the forest, bringing others along. When there were no ordinary people left in the village, they almost immediately killed that man. Since then, no new residents have appeared there, and tourists who wish to stay in that village for a week or two disappear. Chris reread the comments several times, then put down his phone and tried to process what he had read. It turned out he was no longer safe. But then why hadn't they killed him right away? Probably they hadn't noticed. Tomorrow, I need to get out of here during the day. Better yet, in the morning. But how to do it, he pondered. He spent the rest of the night planning his escape and finally decided how to carry it out. In the morning, he got up as usual and went to the kitchen for breakfast. Grace placed a large cast iron skillet with fried eggs on the table, along with several slices of homemade bread. "Good morning," Chris greeted everyone, forcing a faint smile. "Yeah," replied Grace, noisily sipping from her mug. "Morning, morning," said Henry, then turned to his wife. "Grace." "What?" "Go to the chicken coop and grab the eggs from the hens." "What, weren't the fried ones enough for you?" "Get them," I said. Without a word, Grace got up and trudged out to the yard. Chris was left alone with Henry. "How did you sleep?" Henry asked Chris. The question unsettled the young man, and for good reason. First, Henry usually didn't start conversations. And second, had the homeowner caught him outside in the yard the previous night? "Oh, like a log," he lied. "And you didn't go to the bathroom at night?" "Nope," Chris said curtly, averting his gaze. "Well, all right then, yup." The guy thought that now was not the best time to escape, so he decided to stay until evening. All day he tried to behave as usual, but it went poorly. His tongue would trip over itself, things kept slipping from his hands, and he jumped at every sound near him. Closer to evening, or more precisely around 5 o'clock, Chris realized there was no point in delaying any longer. He decided not to run, but to pretend that he wanted to go to the store for groceries. So, the guy left most of his belongings in the room to avoid suspicion. He only took the car keys and his phone with him. He had brought his camera in the morning, and when the owner asked why he needed it, Chris said he wanted to take pictures of nature. To make it convincing, he had to go to the most picturesque places and take photos, even though he was far from in the mood for it. After the walk, Chris discreetly left the camera in the car and slipped back into the house. Before leaving, he prayed that Grace would be somewhere at the far end of the garden and Henry would be holed up in the bathroom or the sauna. The moment came when everyone except him really did leave the house. Then he resolutely headed for the yard, but on the porch, he bumped into a smoking Henry. "Ah, you!" "Almost knocked me over." "Oh, sorry, please," Chris said calmly and then walked toward the car. "And where are you off to?" "Well, I thought I'd go to the store for groceries." "For groceries?" Henry repeated. "Yeah, why?" "We've got plenty of food." "No, I don't want that." "Something like lemonade or some sweets." "Ah," he drawled. "Well, suit yourself." "Want me to bring you anything?" It seemed like such a simple question, but it made the owner of the house laugh like a horse. Through his laughter, he said he didn't need anything. Then Chris mustered his courage, opened the car, and inserted the key into the ignition. "What's this?" he whispered through his lips. The starter wouldn't even turn. Then Chris tried turning on the headlights, but there was no reaction. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his heart began pounding wildly. He pulled his sweaty palms off the steering wheel, struggled to open the car door, and stepped outside on shaky legs. Opening the hood, he saw that the battery was missing from its usual spot. While he was processing what had happened, a heavy hand suddenly rested on his shoulder. He let out a short cry and turned his head back. Standing behind him was Henry. "Something wrong?" "There's no battery. Can you imagine?" "What a mess," he said, spreading his hands. "Looks like you're not going anywhere now." Chris ignored his words about not leaving and asked the question that was bothering him. "Do you know who could have taken it?" "Well, it was me," Henry said. "Why?" Chris feigned surprise, although he perfectly understood why the owner of the house had taken his battery. "Oh, you thought you were smarter than everyone, huh?" "What do you mean?" "Who told you to go outside at night?" "I didn't go outside." "Don't lie." "The three of us saw you running back to the house." Chris realized there was no way out, and it was time to make a move. He gathered all his strength and punched Henry straight in the gut. The man couldn't make a sound and doubled over in pain. Chris took advantage of this and ran off. He saw people in the yard staring at him and heard them whistling and calling after him, but he didn't stop and kept running. Then, like a bolt from the blue, a gunshot rang out. Chris felt a burning pain in one leg. He could no longer run, nor could he stand. As soon as he fell and stretched out on the dirt road, people immediately ran toward him. But they weren't running to help. Right in front of his face, jaws snapped. A stout woman sank her teeth into his face and pulled with all her might. In the next second, she was chewing a piece of his cheek. Chris screamed in pain at the top of his lungs. A thought flashed through his mind that it couldn't get any worse. But it was only the beginning. The villagers, as if they had gone mad, began tearing the guy apart with their bare hands. Several people grabbed his shot leg and, with inhuman strength, ripped it off. Blood gushed immediately. Soon, Chris died from shock. He had no chance of survival. Even if it weren't for the shock, blood loss would have been the cause of death. The people who had emerged from the forest many years ago never kept outsiders with them. Some, so to speak, got lucky and didn't die but became one of these creatures. But mostly, the locals preferred to deviate from their usual diet and include human flesh in their meals from time to time. Soon, Henry returned the battery to Chris's car. The villagers even tried to drive it for a while, but later decided to quietly dismantle it and sell the parts. After all, if done carefully, no one would suspect anything. No one knew that Chris had gone in that direction. He hadn't told his parents, friends, or girlfriend about his trip. He never reported his whereabouts to his friends, didn't want to tell his parents because they would bombard him with questions later, and had quarreled with his girlfriend a few days before leaving. Besides, the guy simply wanted to enjoy some peace and quiet.